I have to apologize for being seriously sleepy at the moment. I'm reminded of the government minister at the beginning of the last century who said that he dreamt that he was addressing the House of Lords and woke up to find that he was doing so. So if I drift off, then please throw things at me, or I especially asked to have the microphone so that I could be freed from the text. I hate being anchored to a text, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to anchor myself now, otherwise I shall drift off into incomprehensibility. So in the first lecture, we tried to see how Peter's vocation was setting off for an unknown future. He gave up a known way as a fisher of fish and embraced a life full of surprises. And by our vows, we promised to let God go on surprising us until we reach the kingdom, which is beyond all we can imagine. We entrust ourselves into God's hands. It's terrible to fall into the hands of God. But as D.H. Lawrence once said, it's much more terrible to fall out of them. I'm reminded of the story of the man who was driving along the top of a cliff, trying to work out whether he believed in God or not. And he got so caught up in the question that he went over the cliff. And as he fell through the air, he clung to a branch and hung there. And then he realized that the question of God's existence was of some immediate and practical significance. And so he cried out, "Is there anybody there? Is there anybody there?" And this voice said, "Yes, yes, my son, there is somebody here." He said, "Save me." And the voice said, "All you have to do is to let go and drop, and I will catch you." So he said, "Thank you." And then he said, "Is there anybody else there?" And the trouble is that we don't just let ourselves go to fall into the hands of God. We fall into the hands of our brothers and sisters. And you've no idea what they will do with us. And this is scary. They may send you on some dangerous mission when you really want to stay at home, or the other way around. I remember when I was examined for solemn profession, and they said, "Is there anything that you don't want to do?" And I said, "There's only one thing. I never ever want to be a superior." I then had almost 20 years uninterrupted. Well, at least they didn't make me a vocations director. That's something. We'll see. For our contemporaries, it's not just scary, it's incomprehensible. And it runs directly contrary to our modern understanding of what it means to be a free, autonomous adult, which is to have control over your own life. It looks infantile and oppressive, as if religious are immature people who dare not grow up and take hold of their own lives. As I said this morning, Western society is marked by a profound distrust of all institutions: government, business, the law, the police, the church. Institutions are seen as imprisoning us in their own agendas. It's an infringement of my liberty for anybody to tell me what I should do. So how can we promise to belong forever? And let's be honest, many religious congregations did have a tradition of obedience that was infantile. Superiors in some congregations treated their brothers and sisters as if they were children. I never experienced this, but I've heard all the horror stories of upside down planted cabbages and all that. And this must be why so many religious to this day find it very hard to live in community. Vast numbers of religious have fled community, and they live in flats alone. And often it's because they have suffered so much in infantile, puerile forms of community. They got so much hurt that they can't cope with the risk. But we will never attract young people to belong to us unless we dare to belong to each other. In a world that's scared of community, we have to be signs of those who take that risk. The risk of belonging. The risk of Jesus, who placed his body in the hands of his disciples and said, "This is my body and I give it to you. And I know what you will do with me." So we can think of vocation as having a double dimension. We place ourselves in God's hands, promising to let ourselves go on being surprised. And we place ourselves in the hands of our brothers and sisters, daring to belong. Let me put it another. I should have asked for a board. Richard Rohr wrote a book in which he talked about the three forms of story in Scripture. How you have my story, our story, and the story. I have to confess I've never read the book, and I've no idea what to do with it, but I think it can be an illuminating way of understanding, if you want, the risks and excitement of a vocation. My story, the story that I tell of myself, that makes sense of my life from beginning to the end. Our story, the story that every institution, every ethnic or national identity will tell to say who we are. The story that Americans tell about how you made that fateful and wrong decision to break with the mother country. Come back, all is forgiven. But it could be the story of St. Francis, the Franciscans, or whoever. And then there is the story which goes from creation to the kingdom, the big story, the long story, the story in which we ultimately find ourselves. So you could say that this morning, I should have remembered to ask for a board. This morning, I was exploring the relationship between my story and the story. How Peter the fisherman found his story, his little life, disrupted. He was caught up in something bigger, the gospel story, which wrenched him out of Galilee and sent him to Jerusalem and on to Rome. His story became part of the story of redemption. The important story for Peter thereafter is no longer his autobiography, but it's this larger story in which Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." So Peter's real story now doesn't go from his birth to his death. It's part of the long story of redemption. So that's the relationship between my story and the story. What I want to look at this afternoon is a slightly different thing. It's the relationship between my story and our story. The story that we tell of ourselves and the stories that we tell of our communities. You see, when Peter left his nets and followed Jesus, he had to say "we" in a new way. He was no longer just a member of the fishing community. He was one of the disciples. He embraced a new form of belonging. In fact, he did more than that. He entered a story in which we could all belong. So, the question I want to put to you to begin with is, what sort of stories do you offer people who think of joining you? What are the stories that enable you to say, we Mercy Sisters, we Carmelites, we Redemptorists? Is it a we that extinguishes the story that I might tell of myself? Does it snuff out my individuality? Does it turn me into an identikit friar, a member of the Dominican pack of hounds? Or does it make me free and strong? What sort of home do we offer those who come to us? Shortly after the death of St. Dominic, if I could just share something from my own tradition, shortly after he died, when all the founders were beginning to die, they realized they had to preserve the stories of the beginning. But they didn't write a life of St. Dominic. They wrote something called the Vitae Fratrum, the lives of the brethren. They didn't give Dominic a private story, his story. It would have made no sense to do that, because he always refused the identity of being the great founder. His gift was to create a space where people could be brothers and sisters. So to write the story of Dominic would have been to contradict what his life was all about. His gift was to create a space in which lots of people could have their stories. So what sort of stories do we tell? Again, in my own tradition, I think often in the Dominican order we make a great mistake. When we tell stories to the young, we tell them about great and glorious Dominicans. About Dominic, and Albert the Great, and Catherine, Martin de Porres, Fra Angelica, you name it, Chanu, Congar. We tell about the great and the glorious. And this can have two unintended consequences. The young may wonder, what place is there for someone like me? For the ordinary, the mediocre, the fragile, the frail brother and sister, with our struggles and our defeats and our victories. Can I belong among all these heroes? When I announced to my beloved Benedictine great uncle that I was going to be a Dominican, he said, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" He said, "Aren't they supposed to be rather intelligent?" And then he thought for a while. And he said, "No, I've known some stupid Dominicans. Yeah, you got a chance." I think we have to find ways of sharing stories of our brothers and sisters who are mediocre and ordinary, who struggle. Keep on going. And somehow maybe survive. I remember one old brother called John. And when he died, I saw him about the day before he died. He said, "I'm so pleased," he said. "I've died a Dominican." He said, "I always was terrified I'd end up out of the order." You see what a small ambition, but that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Like I remember a famous occasion of a funeral in the early 70s when everything was coming to bits. We buried one of the brethren, and they said, "Well, that's an odd way to leave the order." So we have to find stories that make sense of the ordinary brother and sister. It can work the other way around. I remember when I was provincial, we were getting lots of vocations from Glasgow in Scotland. And I thought, what a bright idea is we're strengthening the presence of the brethren in northwestern Scotland, and that means we'll get lots more vocations. Wise old friar said that should be the last thing we should do. He said, because if they were to meet any Republicans, that might put them off joining altogether. Becoming one of us. It's a slow travail. It's a rebirth at a deep level. And I want to suggest three elements in this process of transformation, in which one is summoned, called to belong. I'm sure you will think of others. The first is a sort of self-forgetfulness, which leads to self-discovery. Secondly, we have to learn how to engage in conversation with those who are different from us and yet the same. And finally, our brothers and sisters help us to discover who we are. They are the co-authors of my story. Let's begin with the first one, self-forgetfulness. Almost the first words of Peter in Luke Acts are, "Depart from me, I am a sinful man." And his last words, I don't know whether you ever noticed, the last words of Peter in Luke Acts are, "We believe that we shall be saved through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, just as the Gentiles will be." He begins with I, focusing on himself, his sinfulness, and he ends with the grace of a new we. This is a passage from I to we, which goes through all sorts of moments of failure, of struggle. The turning point, the most painful moment, perhaps almost the last time he ever says I, is when he says, "I do not know the man." And that is the most profound and negative self-forgetfulness, and forgetfulness of who is his Lord. That sort of self-forgetfulness is extremely hard in our culture because of our consecration of a particular form of individualism. The modern understanding of self, which we usually associate with Descartes, is founded on self-consciousness. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I think of myself thinking, and therefore I know that I am. The modern idea of identity is founded on reflexive self-awareness. I am aware of myself. I'm aware of myself being aware of myself. And so in this culture, which has dominated the West for 300 years, self-forgetfulness is very frightening because it implies a sort of mental suicide, a black hole. If you forget yourself, you might cease to exist. The profound insecurity of the modern person means we need all the assurance we can get that we really do exist. It's like we have to go on pinching ourselves all the time. And so much contemporary spirituality is the cultivation of self. New Age spirituality is often called in the books self-spirituality. The self is sacred, and I must tend it with care. Meditation, gurus, Eastern wisdom, pottery, they can all be called upon to show that I am. The self stuck at the center. As Noel Coward once said when he met a friend after many years, "I'm afraid there's not enough time to talk about both of us. Let's talk about me." Someone once wrote to a famous rabbi, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, saying he was deeply unhappy he wrote to the rabbi and he said, I would like the Rebbe's help. I wake up each day, sad and apprehensive. I can't concentrate. I find it hard to pray. I keep the commandments, but I find no satisfaction. I go to the synagogue, but I feel alone. I begin to wonder what life is about. I need help. And the Rebbe simply underlined the first word of each sentence, which is always the same, I. A vocation calls upon us to leave the center of the stage, to give up being the still point at the center of the universe and join humanity. I want us to dare to let go of the branch of selfhood and drop off. How can I do that? The more that I command myself to stop thinking about myself, the more that I'm likely to think of myself trying to not think of myself. I remember a wonderful young chap we had in the English province. He was so good. He was so kind. He was so bright. But he couldn't stop thinking about himself. Every time he read a book, he thought about himself reading the book. When he went to pray, he thought about himself being there praying and thinking whether God was noticing him praying too. Finally, we had to really ask him to leave the order and hope he would desperately fall in love. If only he could fall in love with somebody else. Maybe he could become a Dominican. So many of Jesus' parables are explosive. They subvert oneself from being the center of the stage. I suppose the obvious example that you'd all think of would be about the Good Samaritan, where the lawyer starts off by saying, and who is my neighbor? And is brought at the end of the parable to ask, and who proved themselves to be neighbor to the man by the roadside? It's that displacement, that subversion of oneself in the middle. That's true humility. Humility is not thinking ill of yourself. It's not thinking, I am a worm and no man. Strictly between these four walls. I used to get driven mad in Rome sometimes by letters from Spanish nuns. And they all used to end, I am the least of your sisters and the most unworthy member of the Dominican family. And used to think there's hot competition in the humility stakes going on here. I never got any letters from the brethren like that, I might say. For St. Thomas Aquinas, the brethren check whether I mention his name in every lecture, you see. For St. Thomas Aquinas, humility is having a true estimation of your value. As a French Dominican, Jean-Louis Bruguet said, humility is the Christian name for self-esteem. Thanks to humility, I rest in myself, content to be who I am. A self-acceptance that's not the same as self-satisfaction. And having accepted myself, then I'm free to forget myself. According to Buddhism, of which I know very little, so please forgive me if I'm wrong, one of the ways that you break the sort of centripetal force of the ego is through ceasing to desire. And there is much in this. It's a very illuminating tradition, which I'm really very ignorant of. And maybe Christianity has something to learn here. But also it can be that it is precisely passion that breaks, if you want, that liberates us from narcissism. When I was a provincial and I used to examine candidates to the order, the first thing I would say is, are they passionate about something? It almost doesn't matter what they're passionate about. as long as they're passionate about something. Because if they're passionate, then they can forget themselves. And if they can forget themselves, they can become one of us. There are forms of eucalyptus in Australia which can only germinate if there is a forest fire. You need a fire which is strong enough to crack the shell, and then the fruit can germinate. And I think that when you look at people joining the order, you say, is there anything far enough in there to crack the shell? It might be an intellectual passion. Vincent McNabb, one of our brethren in the 20s, used to say to the novices, think of anything, but for God's sake, think. Lagrange used to say in his biblical study, sciens et prudens, knowingly and prudently I put my hand in the fire. Maybe it could be a passion for justice and peace, but make one so vulnerable to the hurt of other people that one will forget oneself for a moment. Graham Greene said, you know you have a soul when we become sorrowful because of the sorrow of another. Might be a pastoral passion. It almost doesn't matter. Ultimately, of course, it's love that breaks open that hard shell. As an Irish Benedictine called Mark Patrick Hademan wrote, love is the only impetus that's sufficiently overwhelming to force us to leave the comfortable shelter of our well-armed individuality, shed the impregnable shell of self-sufficiency, and crawl out nakedly into the danger zone beyond, the melting pot where individuality is purified into personhood. You can think of it as a stoking up of the fire of humble ambition. Our young should be passionately ambitious to do something for the Lord. Each day we sing the Magnificat, which tells of how a young girl, through her, the Lord did marvelous things. We should expect the young with us to do marvelous things. Things that you and I could never do. That's why hope and humility go together. Hope teaches us to dream of marvelous deeds. And humility ensures that they are the deeds that I could do, not the deeds of some imaginary super friar. So vocation is the summons to belong. It's the freedom to say we. And the first step into this freedom is the liberation from self-preoccupation, center of the stage. The second stage is learning to share my lives with those who are different. Peter is someone out of the nice, safe, secure little world of fisher people who he's known all his life, who aren't so different from himself. And Luke Acts carries him towards that longed-for, dreaded encounter with the person who's as different as can be, Paul. It's as hard to imagine such a big difference, isn't it, between this simple Galilean fisherman and Paul, the sophisticated rabbi. You always feel that Peter is oscillating between loving him and hating him. But they'll both end up taking the same roads to Rome, and there they will die as martyrs. And that's why Rome is such a center for our church, because it is where two very different people were buried together. No community of the like-minded can point to the kingdom. Are our communities signs of the kingdom? Do we try and recruit people with whom we are at ease because they are like us? Do we live in communities of the like-minded? The church in the United States, as you know better than I, is probably more polarized than any other part of the Roman Catholic Church. Here one senses deep divisions between progressives and liberals, conservatives. Each side have their own theologians, their own gurus, their own newspapers, their own periodicals, their own seminaries, their own faculties, their own congregations. And in this polarized church, could we imagine that religious life could be a prophetic sign, a sign of contradiction? Now, often we religious see this as meaning that we should be the party of the opposition. And historically, this has often been our role. For most of my life, it has. But at this moment, might we dare imagine a real sign of something new? Might we have a prophetic vocation now to be a place in which polarization is transcended, in which, as St. Paul says, the wall of hostility is broken down, in which the church learns to say, once again, we. A community of the right or a community of the left may not be a sign of anything but itself. To be prophetic is sometimes to be against. That was, I suppose, the experience of most of my life. That was the great saying in France, do you remember, in Paris in the 1960s, Je suis contre, moi je suis contre. As for me, I am against. Anything. But maybe what might be really prophetic at this stage, at the beginning of a new millennium, is to create new spaces, oases, breathing places, where divisions are transcended. My most dramatic experience of this, as I've often recounted in many lectures, was in Burundi during the time of civil war, which alas, sadly, still continues. War between Tutsis and Hutus. I remember once traveling around the country for a few days, accompanied by the local superior, who was Tutsi, and my Sochius for Africa, who was Hutu. We traveled for days. We saw one car, and that contained a chain-smoking bishop. There was nobody else on the road. Everybody was hiding. Everybody went into refugee camps. And we had to try to find the brethren and the brethren's families, and it meant going into, if we went into a Tutsi camp, normally a military camp, we'd bring the Hutu brother with us, which is very brave of him. But we'd have to, as it were, guarantee his life. And if we went to a rebel encampment, the Hutus, then we had to take the Tutsi brother with us to guarantee his life. You couldn't have left him outside. He'd be dead when you got back. And every evening we celebrated the Eucharist together. And they weren't always easy Eucharists. Often there was tension because of what we'd seen each day. But they were Eucharists that pointed to the kingdom. They pointed beyond any identity that we could have in that terrible, war-torn world. You see, the most intense pain, and also one of the most beautiful things, is to belong to those who are like me and unlike me. Part of my identity, and yet perhaps in contradiction to what I see as central. Those tensions are hardest within the family. I'm one of 6. I don't know about you, but I can be immensely tolerant of other people. But if it's my own brothers and sisters, and they aren't taking the right view of things, it's the bitterness you find in Northern Ireland. between Protestants and Catholics. Michael Ignatieff tells a sad story on the war zone in Yugoslavia in 1993. Sad story. Right up on the front line, he asks a Serbian why the Croats are so different. I quote, "The man I'm talking to takes a cigarette pack from his khaki jacket. 'See this,' he says. 'These are Serbian cigarettes, and over there they smoke Croat cigarettes.' 'But they're both cigarettes, right?' 'You foreigners don't understand a thing.' He shrugs and begins to clean his Zastrovo machine pistol. But the question I've asked bothers him. And so a couple of minutes later, he tosses the weapon on the bunk and he says, 'Look, this is how it is. Those Croats, they think they're better than us. They think they're fancy Europeans and everything. But I tell you something, we're all just Balkan rubbish.' It's a sad story because it's a story of the pain of sameness and difference. I think in some ways that's what we're struggling with inside the church today. Sameness and difference. It's often the major drama of the novitiate. I break from my past, I join this community, I look to find brothers who will be like me and share my dreams, talk like me, think like me, vote like me, and damn it, look at them. I come as a nice, young, liberal, Catholic, intellectually open, and there's Brother X, who thinks nobody can be a true Dominican or Catholic unless they accept every word of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. I come to the order passionate for justice and peace, and there is my brother who votes Republican, supports the war in Iraq. I come to the order to find a home, and this is the brother I find in the center of my home. So central, I think, to becoming one of us is learning to belong to those whose convictions are so different. And this requires an act of the imagination. One has to imagine how someone who is so close, who is one's flesh and blood, and with whom one agrees over so much, nevertheless holds views which seem to be absurd and even wicked. One has to project oneself beyond the framework of one's ways of seeing the world and enter their skin, see through their eyes. This is an act of intellectual charity, not just the heart, but of the mind. One has to love if one is to learn to see. Iris Murdoch, who is an English philosopher, she wrote, "The great artists see their objects," and this is true whether they are sad, absurd, repulsive, or even evil, in the light of justice and mercy. The direction of attention is contrary to nature, outward, away from the self, reduces all to a false unity and towards the great surprising variety of the world. The ability so to see is love. So becoming one of us, one of the brothers, one of the sisters, is a work of the imagination and the intellect. We have to imagine how that other person might be, see, hear. But the paradox is that when you love them, you discover they are beyond imagination. And we'll always go on being surprised by them. This is the paradox. Imagination leads you to its limit, to the unimaginable other. So we saw in the first lecture how the vows make us promise always to be surprised by God. They also require of us that we always be surprised by our brothers and sisters. You see, one way to protect yourself against the other is to decide we always know what they're about to say, and we know who they are. They are a typical 60s lefty or 90s conservative or Californian hippie or New York liberal. And so we make ourselves invulnerable to surprise. Becoming one of us means being bound up with people who may remain surprises. This is what Martin Buber calls living in holy insecurity. It's a beautiful phrase, holy insecurity. To live together is to abide in this insecurity and not to run away from it. We must endure the complexity. We must love the complexity of our brothers and sisters. When we talk to each other, we must be able to go away at the end of the conversation unafraid of remaining puzzled. We must be able to go to sleep at night unafraid that so much is unresolved, that we're just on the pilgrimage. So a religious vocation is the summons to belong. I have to say we. I can say we Dominicans arrived in Oxford in 1221. It doesn't matter the fact I wasn't born. I can say we've just founded a new project in Ethiopia. It doesn't matter that it's another province. And this means a self-forgetfulness. It means an engagement at the deepest level with those who are different. And finally, it means that we are not the sole authors of our lives. Each of us does not decide alone who we are. Embracing our brothers and sisters means that we let them be co-authors of our stories. Once again, we can see this with Peter. In Jesus Christ Superstar, the Apostles thing, I've just seen my old friend James there. I'm a bit shy singing in front of him, but Jesus Christ Superstar, do you remember the Apostles sing? I'm not sure with my cough I'll be able to, but I'll have a bash. Always wanted to be an apostle, knew that I couldn't make it if I tried. Then we will retire, we can write the gospel so that they'll still talk about us when we've died. Great, well done. I think there's some censorship going on here. No, it's a nice line, I love it. But the truth is that Peter didn't write any of the Gospels. He was more written about than writing. The moment that Peter followed Jesus, he surrenders the control over the writing of his story. Other people will have a part in writing it for him. He gets cast in roles that he might not like much. 4 gospel writers, these 4 canonical gospel writers and many others, are sharpening their pens to tell us who he is. I can't help wondering whether Peter had a sharp word with them in heaven. Now, John, this bit about the John resurrection scene, when you describe me as lumbering along, blowing and puffing behind you, that's not quite how I remember it. When we give our lives to our communities, we no longer decide exactly who we are. I may come to the order thinking that I'm Thomas Aquinas reborn, or New St. Dominic, or the latest incarnation of Bartolome de las Casas. But my brethren may gently or not so gently show that I am not. I'm just Timothy Radcliffe, and that's enough. They will discern skills, that I have skills and talents that I thought I had not got, and that I have not got gifts that I thought that I had. I trust in their perceptions. When we place our lives in the hands of our brothers and sisters, a profession We put our hands in their hands. We put our lives in their hands to write stories. This doesn't mean to say that I should just be passive in the identity I'm given. There is an interplay. If I were to be proposed as provincial bursar, I would be right to vigorously resist. The province would be broke within a month. Anybody who thought I had that identity would be simply wrong. You may think the same thing about being named sometimes directors of vocations. Our stories may demand even that sometimes I do what I don't do best. At the moment, we have the syndic, the bursar of my province, is an extremely gifted young guy doing his doctorate on French literature, an American, as it turns out. Because of the needs that we have at this moment, he has to surrender that role for a while and be the provincial bursar. In a way, it's a waste. But it's our story. At this moment, our story needs that sacrifice. But if our story were to become oppressive of the stories of the brethren, if it were to suffocate them, snuff them out, then it wouldn't be a gospel story. Our story is only an evangelical story if it cares for the flourishing of the individual stories of the brethren. Peter is not purely passive. He's called to become a fisher of people alive. Jesus calls him to call other people. You could say that this isn't only the story about how Peter receives his vocation, it's also about how Peter is called to be the first vocation director. He is your patron saint. And this calling is not just the entry to the calling to enter religious life. It's the summons that we go on giving to each other throughout the whole of religious life. We call to each other all the time. We summon each other to be brave. We invite each other to carry on the adventure, to keep on walking. We are called all along the way, and like Peter, we call each other and are called. I remember going on a holiday with some of my brethren in Scotland on the Isle of Skye. And we had a wonderful day. We climbed this great high mountain. And when we came down, the only way to get home, we had to go along a cliff top. And it involved a rather dangerous passage where there was no path. You had to fit your feet into a sort of a split in back again, and lean and feel your way along. And the last person to go was Gareth. Gareth Moore, he was called. And when we all emerged at the other end, we suddenly realized that Gareth wasn't there. It was a terrible moment because, it was quite a dangerous fall into the sea. And one of us had to go back. And there was Gareth stuck on the rock, quivering. He hadn't told any of us that he suffered from acute vertigo. So we had to invite him to make his way along the cliff. Gareth, it's okay. Gareth, now 6 inches on your right there is a hold. Now Gareth, move your leg along. Now stop there, you're doing fine, it's only another 12 feet. We got him there, and he's a very brave. Unfortunately, he died of cancer of the liver, aged 52 last year, which is great sorrow. He was a brave man. I remember the next day he said, okay, he said, lead me to a high cliff. But I think for me it's an image about how often in religious life we summon each other and we are summoned. We share Peter's vocation to call and to go on calling. So let me stop now. Let me summarize and make one last brief point. So in the first lecture, I talked about my story and the story. I talked about how a vocation is finding oneself in the big story, which goes from creation to redemption, being open to all the surprises on the way. In the second lecture, I talked about my story and our story. A vocation is the call to belong, to say we. We dare place ourselves in the hands of the brothers and sisters. If I were to be complete, then I would have to give a third lecture on the relationship between our story and the story. I'd have to explore the relationship between the story we tell of our communities and the big story of redemption. But you are very fortunate in being spared that lecture. I would make one point, briefly. Religious communities are all inclined to dramas, not to mention melodramas. As individuals and communities, we live through dramatic moments with each other, especially in formation communities, which is why I remember the only reason I ever accepted to be provincial was it got me out of the formation community after 23 years, and I'm back there again now. I think at this moment in the West, religious life is living through its own dramas. Some congregations having few or no vocations, facing extinction, dramas of accusation, sexual abuse. But the big story, the story which goes from creation to the kingdom, robs all our smaller dramas of their sting. They're not so dramatic after all. I think that one of the main responsibilities of anyone with responsibility in a congregation is to be the calm center, the person who de-dramatizes it all. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Nothing else after that is quite so exciting. And when you pledge your life to a particular congregation, then one promises that the death and resurrection of Christ is the only story which really counts, and that all the other dramas don't matter much. I first learnt about a big lesson about how to be a superior when I was a young friar. This was back in the late 60s. And our community in Oxford was attacked by some right-wing group, the National Front. They didn't like our opinions on various political subjects, and they set off little, very small bombs, but they were big enough to give us a shock and destroy all the windows. We were all woken up. It happened on 2 occasions. Woken up in the middle of the night. We all rushed down to the front. It's the moment when you discover what your brethren wear. I thought nobody had been wearing pajamas for years, but it turned out I was wrong. And suddenly we realized that the prior wasn't there. A chap who's become subsequently a famous theologian called Fergus Kerr, or Kerr. So I rushed up and I knocked on his door and I said, Fergus, there's been a bomb attack. You know, the police were there, the ambulances. And he said, anybody dead? So I said, well, no. Said, anybody wounded? And I said, no. He said, oh, why did you go away? He said, we'll talk about it in the morning. If you live by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, then none of these things are quite so dramatic. Shortly before Bonhoeffer was shot by the Gestapo, he sent a message to his friend, Bishop Bell of Chichester, saying, "The victory is certain. Even being assassinated is not such a big deal if you live by this longer story." Thank you very much.
Luckily, we haven't heard the last word from Timothy, so thank you very much, Timothy. We have a half-hour break, so if you'll please be back by 3. Thank you.
You could move now. Timothy, please.
I don't see us. Oh, there it is. Hi. I'm Carol Breedenkamp, Sister of Christian Charity of the Western Province here in Wilmette, Illinois. This is a question coming from a workshop yesterday on postmodernism, and they were saying that postmodernism, okay? And what we were talking about is that there is no narrative, no grand story for these young people that are common to humanity. So if we're trying to connect our story to the story, how do we do that with the millenniums? Because they don't have a grand story, they don't have a narrative.
Okay. That's an interesting. I mean, I think what's sometimes happened is what's been called the privatization of the narrative. I think that, for example, when I was young, we grew up, as I said this morning, with this idea of progress. But it was seen as the progress of humanity, particularly, of course, the progress of the British, but that's all. And I think what's often happened is what Zygmunt Bauman, I mentioned this morning, has called the privatization of progress. So that the only progress that we imagine is the one that I might make myself. And I think everybody retains at least that minimal sort of narrative. Now, when we say that people have lost the grand narrative, I think that in a way, we don't want to offer them a grand narrative. I think the story, like the grand narratives of the 19th century, you had the Darwinian grand narrative, you had the imperial grand narrative, you had all sorts of forms of grand narrative, and that they have collapsed. I'm not sure that that's the story that we really want to offer people now in postmodernity. Because the big story that we can offer within our communities and our congregations certainly tells a story of the past. But it's essentially, I think, a story about, if you want, the unpredictable eruption of grace now. And which, in fact, calls us beyond any grand narrative. So I think in this, I mean, I'm always a bit uncertain about what postmodernity means. But if we use that sort of term, the loss is not entirely a bad one. because the grand narrative can be a bit of a prison too. We still tend to have it, I think, economically. There's still a thing like what you might call Darwinian, the grand narrative of Darwinian economics, you know, the survival of the fittest, the triumph of the strong, on this entirely mythological, equal, level playing field. But I think what we offer is something where every actor, every participant is in fact helping something new to happen.
Linda Sargi, Holy Cross sister from Merrill, Wisconsin, living and working in Region 5, New Orleans. Timothy, at our table, we were speaking of, you know, we fully agree with what you said about not wanting to just perpetuate, you know, carbon copies of ourselves, wonderful as we are. But at the same time, can you say more about the delicate balance that we have to try to maintain as people who assist others in this search for who they are? It's like, how different can you be and still have us mutually conclude that we're the ones you belong with and not another group? I mean, otherwise we could all be one big group.
Yeah.
You know what I'm...
Yeah, it's a difficult question because often you only discover the answer later. It's rather like if you were to write your story. Let's imagine that you were writing your story and maybe 10 years ago when you were 16, and you tried to imagine at that stage becoming a sister. And you might have said, looking at your 16-year-old self, no way, when you're 16, no way, me, one of those. And it would look as if it was in complete discontinuity with all that you'd been up till then. 10 years later, when you're 26, you can look back and you can say, now I see, actually, that the girl, 16-year-old girl who was, well, I won't reveal my secret knowledge of your past, smoking cigarettes behind the sports hall or whatever. Now one could see how actually implicitly there was already something coming to crystallization that found its proper form in your vocation. It's only, as it were, post factum you can look back and say, gosh, actually, it makes sense. And I think it's a little bit the same way with the young. We can't theoretically decide very often what will count as fidelity and what will count as just being wishy-washy, what will count as betrayal. So that when we look at the young, very often we want to know what would count, for example, as being faithful to the Dominican tradition. And it's very difficult to know a priori. It's like when it comes, when it emerges, somehow we, and not all of us, not all at the same time, may say, yes, now I see. Yeah, that is in continuity. Like I mentioned this morning, one of our brethren who used to teach ballet at Washington University before he joined the order. For many of the older guys, they would have said, what? They would have probably been really quite shocked that this guy could ever see that as part of a preaching of the gospel. And yet, as it evolves, as you look at it, people could begin to, as it were, recognize, if you want, what was a fertile development rather than a betrayal of the tradition. So that's the first thing I'd say. It's very hard to know in advance. I think each of our each of our religious lives and each of our religious traditions reflects what I like to call ecologies. They are ways of life which require all sorts of elements and for them to flourish. So that, for example, you know that if you're going to be a Franciscan, there are certain elements of life which one would hope to find. Poverty, you know, certain respect to creation, something of the joy and liberty of St. Francis, and so on. And maybe you could think of the continuity as almost like the development of the ecosystem, rather than the fulfilling of a law. Does that make any sense at all?
Janet Ryan, a sister of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, and I'm in the Northwest Region 12. I think you gave a new lens to the prophetic role when you talked about, first of all, how polarized our world is, our church is. And you spoke about the religious community being a perfect place where polarization is transcended or divisions are suspended. Well, it excited my heart, and I wondered if you'd speak a little more to that.
Well, I was hoping you might all tell me. I think one thing is that requires is immense patience. When I joined the order in the mid-60s, I remember some of the older brethren who were scandalized by us. We were throwing off our habits and in a glorious liberty, all putting on black anoraks and blue jeans. But the ones that really enabled us to flourish were the ones who were patient. They didn't stand in judgment. Gervais, I mentioned Gervais, the guy who died this morning. He was a well-known eccentric. I used to be guest master at the end of this 1 year, finding there were no sheets left in the house. And I went in, and he'd never understood that when you put the new sheets on, you had to take the old sheets off. He was a well-known university teacher, only person in Oxford who's ever been a member of 4 faculties. And as I took away the sheets, bits of archaeology, pottery, Sumerian pottery, I found old papers, the odd ham sandwich, you know, we went. And I remember saying to Gervais, after he'd voted in favor of some new experiment of the young, and I said, but Gervais, you disagree with all this, don't you? And he said, oh, I disagree with it. Yes, it makes no sense to me. But he said, you have always to support what is new. And sometimes this might mean that you have to welcome into your congregation people who may look to you very different, and often in these days, in many parts of the world, more conservative than my generation. And then the temptation is to say, get them out of their habits, you know, these young guys. And this is exactly the sort of judgmentalism that we didn't receive from an earlier generation for us, and which we should not have. And it requires, I think, a real humility of heart and patience, and the sense that you don't immediately understand why people are as they are. I think it's, in my characteristic, and when things are really healthy, you find that the friendships that people form have nothing to do with ideology. The friendships where you reach out and feel you can say anything are often with those with whom you really disagree. But You have all the security to say everything. I remember I mentioned my friend Gareth Moore this afternoon, just at the end. We disagreed about everything. But we could always talk. I remember one evening going in to see him at 10 o'clock at night to discuss some arrangement in the Priory when I was prior. And we started to talk. We started to argue. And suddenly I realized it was dawn. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. We didn't even have a bottle of whiskey. Now, I think it's that patient friendship, which means it's the asceticism of not succumbing to knee-jerk reactions. We have so many knee-jerk reactions against people who we feel have betrayed all we fought for, you know? So I think it's patience, I think it's humility, it's letting the other be. What, in that nice phrase from Heidegger, Gelassenheit, letting be. And that means one has to be able to laugh at oneself, one's own immediate categorization of people.
I'm Cecilia Dwyer, Benedictine from Virginia. Timothy, I'd like to ask a question about lay spirituality. You spoke this morning about a lack of a sense of vocation, even in the work world, in the business world, and I think there's a lack of a sense of vocation of being Christian and what that means to live out that vocation. In Finding the Treasure, Sandra Snyder's talked about the new ministry of religious being that of helping lay people understand the importance of lay spirituality in the church. In other words, it's not doing what Father says we need to do, but to coming to their own sense of spirituality. And I was wondering if you could speak to that in terms of what our role might be. Sandra says we're not to empower, we're not to, put on in any way, but I assume it's a role of affirming, of listening, of encouraging. And I feel like if we help to, mutually walk hand in hand with our lay brothers and sisters, then we're going to have people who are going to then want to walk hand in hand with us and share our story. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, I'm not quite sure what to say. I think that every every religious family embodies a wisdom. For example, the Benedictines. You're a Benedictine, and I have a big soft spot for Benedictines. I've so many great aunts and great uncles and cousins who are all Benedictines. One of the things that I could see was how, if you want, it's a way of life, a humane way of life, that embodies a wisdom. And I think we live in a society which is thirsty for wisdom. And we can't tell the lay people how to live out that wisdom. But I suppose by offering the tradition, then they can surprise us by how they do it. And often maybe what our communities do is not offer, they offer schools, but not perhaps in the old sense of the 12th century abbey schools where people came to sit at the feet, so much as spaces where a wisdom may be shared. And they will tell us how we should live it, a little vocation from time to time, and we can also share with them. I think my insistence this morning that I think usually professed religious life involves a commitment we back again?
Yeah.
one of the most exciting things, which is the emergence of so many schools, if you want, of lay people within religious life. What is it going to yield? I think as long as they see that we don't see them as potential recruits, they are, but we see them as people who have their own dignity, regardless of whether they ever consider joining us. I think they get suspicious if they think, you know, it's rather like trying to trap them, like trying to trap pigeons. You know, you throw the bread on the ground and then drop the net over them when they're there. If they see a real disinterestedness on our part, then I think they will go stronger and we will go stronger. It's funny, you know, this is not quite an answer to your question, but I've got lots of friends who are young women for some reason. And I have a very strong sense that so many of these are looking for a vocation which we haven't yet invented. I mean, I'm in touch with a lot of people just finishing at university, early, mid-20s, and so many of them are looking. And it's not that they're afraid to give their lives forever. I don't think they are. I think that's often our fear. We think that they're afraid of giving their lives forever. But I think very often they're perfectly happy to have a go if we will believe in it. It's like we need a new creativity at this moment in the vocations that the church offers. And so in that sense, I think there's no shortage of vocations. There's a shortage of creativity in imagining vocations.
Okay, I'm Pat Whitberg. I'm a Sister Charity Cincinnati. I'm currently ministering in Indianapolis, so somewhere between Region 6 and Region 7, I guess. I was intrigued, and several of the other people at my table were also, with your description of letting the rest of the community tell your story as, I suppose, one manifestation of obedience. And what struck me, not the rest of my table, from here on it just gets me, what the examples that you used to illustrate that, both this afternoon and this morning, were obviously from your own community. And something that has always seemed to me, it's a generalization I've made in my head, I don't have any real evidence to prove it, but in men's communities, it seems as though the superior, the master general or whatever, still has the authority ceded to them by the membership to call up some guy in Africa and say, I want you to teach in Lyon. In many religious communities of women, the leadership does not have much authority in that way. In some, they have none. And it would be unheard of, to be blunt, in some women's communities, for leadership to call someone and say, you know, we really need someone to teach geography at St. Cunegunda's Parish. It wouldn't be done. And then I had another thought while I was standing here. Maybe the last remnant of the few places where it is done is for Vocation director, but that's another one. But seriously, beyond that, or, you know, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, don't go away then, because
So
then we can...
Oh dear, shucks.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, my first reaction is to say that maybe men had more ways of retaining independence in the old days. I mean, I think there are all sorts of questions like priesthood, which meant that very often, actually, male religious were able to carve out a sort of ongoing independence which protected them sometimes from abusive authority. And maybe, I mean, this is just a hypothesis which I put to you, because I don't know. I'm neither American nor a woman. And could it be the case that therefore it's because of the wounds which was sometimes experienced in the past that this at the moment often cannot happen? Do you think that might be it?
That's my personal, is this on? That's my personal opinion. The question then that follows from that I don't know that I'm necessarily asking you to answer as much as it's just, letting it hang out there for everyone's head to answer. Okay, it's been 40 years, for God's sake. And for the last 40 years, no leadership in my community has ever written a letter to the membership that was any more directive than, dear sisters, it's Advent, let us think holy Advent thoughts. When do we grow out of it?
That's very interesting, and it'll be interesting maybe to get some other reactions to
And
that.
understanding that I'm young enough, barely, to have never been missioned anywhere, ever. No superior since the novitiate has ever told me what I could or could not do. And anyone younger than me probably comes from that same tradition. I may be over-romanticizing something, and if a superior ever told me to do something, I'm like, oh, that's what it's like, ugh. But, as it stands right now, I just point that out.
Thank you.
I'm Marie Annette Seymour. I'm a Sister of Mercy, living in St. Louis. I'm in Region 9, and I'm from Mississippi. I recently just moved. Mine is a little bit different from what she and some of the others, and really was brought out at the table, is one thing that really challenges is we will never, or when you made this statement, that we will never attract others to belong to us unless we belong to each other. And especially as a vocation minister, which I just have had for a few months, a very short time. But I honestly, after being in the community for many years, look at how the challenge of how we do support, encourage, challenge, and especially with the whole idea of accountability, how we really dance around that term many, many times, of accountability with something that's going on locally or wherever else. And we sometimes can talk to each other about it, but directly to the person, it may not get there. Another thing that really is close to my heart is the term or this statement you made about, and you may want to comment on that one, the statement about young people are looking for community life, and I know they are. I just stepped out of 18 years of college campus ministry, and I know they're looking very, very much for community life, Yet at the same time, I would say that I myself lived by myself for about 13 years of my college campus ministry because there were no other, to begin with, there were no other mercies in the area. So it was a real challenge, and always, at the same time, what I really gleaned for myself, living by myself for those years, was tremendously important. And yet I do struggle with the ambiguity, conflict of this whole idea of community life. Could you comment, please?
I wouldn't be very good at commenting because I was on sabbatical after finishing in Rome, and it was I was staying with the brethren out of Berkeley, and I said, do you know what I really want to do? I want to go and have 2 or 3 nights living alone in a house, because I've never ever done it in my life. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a big family. Mm-hmm. We were really in a dozen. Wonderful introduction for religious life. I lived in big communities, and so I've never had that experience until I went on sabbatical. I think clearly sometimes we have to be alone. Often you hear stories of people at the foundation of the church in new places where they have to go out and be alone. I mean, since our sisters can remember dear Samuel Metzachelli, who's barely professed as a Dominican, and he was setting out for years and never saw another Dominican friar, tramping across this very part of the world and founding dioceses and things. So sometimes it's necessary for the mission. But I would have thought that if one goes too long, personally, how would one get back to the art of living with others? I think it is an art, isn't it? Which requires endless negotiation, a particular perception of oneself, all sorts of things. And I've seen that when brethren have moved out and lived alone, they might love the idea of coming back to live in community, but it's very, very hard. Very hard.
And I might add that as I said, I lived alone in an apartment for 13 years, and now I'm living in a convent with three other sisters who are wonderful. And I do get that comment quite a bit. What's the adjustment? And of course there are adjustments, and maybe being the extrovert that I am, I found it very exciting and enlivening and all that. Not that they're not difficulties, but the give and take of that.
What's been the worst difficulty that you can tell us about?
Nothing like vulnerability at this moment. I would say that whole idea of my own space. Because when I'm out and with people and ministry, I give it my 100%. And when I went back to my apartment living by myself, I had time to recoup and regroup. And now when I go back to the convent with three others who are wonderful, but to have the kind of energy to do that with and not just say, well, I'm too tired, I don't have time for you today. And so that real sense of community, of me helping to build community, not just siphon the life out and you realize I have an important job or whatever, because I've heard that. I mean, I think we use that as an excuse sometimes to say I'm just too busy to really throw my hat in with or my whatever, in with the local group. So that has been very challenging.
Thank you. We just got these last two, I'm afraid, I'm told.
If there is someone from the crowd who'd like to respond to the previous speaker at the right microphone about obedience, I would defer to that because it seems like such a valuable conversation to have.
First of all, maybe Mary Marr could pick up on this tomorrow, because I know we have that panel thing, and I think it's a real important question. But I was thinking about the way that we women in religious communities are trying to truly work for collegiality. And I think that it has been my experience, we do not come down hard as hierarchy. Now the responsibility is for all of us to become more collegial by accepting responsibilities. So that was one thing. I also think a lot more of us are being asked to take on internal community service, and we may not have seen that as the true ministry, so I offer that, because groups are older and the younger are being asked to do more. I was thinking about how we help more of our sisters come to assume leadership in relatively short years. That there's training and exposure and opportunity that come, and then we have a chapter for all our members, so there's no way that you don't hear where the true needs and priorities of the community are. And the last one was that even though we aren't changing ministries or being asked to do that, we have new residences that take in temporary vowed, new candidates, are asked to live in novitiate homes, and so maybe it's not specifically about ministry that we're being missioned about, but new forms of our living in very generous ways.
Thank you, that's a good contribution for tomorrow. And here I see somebody with whom I have a lot in common.
Yes.
Because we're both called Timothy.
Yes. I also am Timothy. I am a newly professed member of the Dominican Central Province. In a way, the issue I'm going to ask about is one where you've already alluded to an answer, and perhaps what I'm hoping for is a bit less apathetic of an answer, if there is one. I'm not sure that there is, but I'm hoping that there is. I'm juxtaposing, on the one hand, your insistence that our church needs to achieve the harmonious coexistence of people who think differently, which rings very true in my heart, and I think in many, if not all of our hearts, that we have to achieve that. It's imperative. And on the other hand, something I repeatedly find in Scripture, Paul's insistence when he exhorts the churches to unity, he specifies the kind of unity he's talking about as a unity of mind and heart. And as I juxtapose those two, a preliminary conclusion one could draw is that perhaps unity of mind and heart doesn't mean what I thought it meant. My question then is, if unity of mind and heart does not subsist in political, theological, or ideological uniformity, what does it subsist in? And perhaps to make the question more difficult, what are some manifestations of that unity?
Isn't it lovely to have one's brethren? I think, Timothy, it partly depends upon, I think, if we look at unity of mind and heart, let's look at unity of mind. I think part of the difficulties which create polarization in our church is that unity of mind is often seen in a rather fundamentalist way. I think there's a tendency which we don't only find in Islam, but is characteristic of the whole of really modern culture, which began as a sort of form of scientific literalism, a scientific fundamentalism, which said that really what we really want to know, what we really want to understand, can be understood in these terms. And that fundamentalism is reflected in religious fundamentalism, of which Islam is only one form, and which you find in the church very often. And often it's the loss of a certain humility in the face of the mystery. And I think, speaking as not only one Timothy to another Timothy, but one Dominican to another, we'd recognize that within our tradition, centrally, has always been a belief in, if you want, the unknowability of God. As Aquinas says, what God is, we cannot know. And I think that's a sort of humility in the face of the mystery, which means that faced with other ways of talking, you can cope with difference and recognize family resemblance. Modern fundamentalism has meant that our cultures are generally less tolerant and more presumptuous about what we can say about God. And that means we look for a different sort of unity. We look for an agreement which is often much more verbal, with much more key words, hooray words, boo words, sound words, words that are in and words that are out. And so we lose some of that suppleness, which meant that perhaps our ancestors in the faith could actually live speaking rather different languages, but recognizing that all our attempts to talk of God were trying to reach out for what is beyond our grasp.
Timothy, my morning began with the privilege of introducing you. My afternoon isn't quite over yet, but I get to thank you also. And so in the name of all of us gathered this afternoon, thank you. When you began this morning, I thought we were going to get a little stand-up comedy routine, to be honest. And then you spoke about jet lag and your need for a caffeine hit, and I wondered what you were when you were at high-octane mode. But today... But today you really did nourish us with your gentleness, with your humor, in a profound way, your reflections shared. Through Scripture, through human interaction with the people whose lives you've touched and with whom you have been touched. You challenged us to go prophetically into new spaces, and that is certainly language that we recognize and challenges that we have felt. Danielle Cadrin had told me that you would talk to us about the lives of many people. Not only have you recounted to us their lives, but also your travels, and we have been touched by your life. And for that, I thank you in the name of everybody.